Hi, I hope you have your notes out and ready to go. Feel free to pause this at any point so you can keep up and record down the important information. Indeed, there's one place where you'll have to just totally stop and open up a video. So, our concept here is looking at a really brief view of ancient history. This is a brief view of really the longest epic in human history, and that's our purpose today. I hear that expression, this is ancient history. Often we say, well, that's ancient history, meaning it doesn't matter anymore. But I really find that this is really terribly wrong. It's one of the reasons why we're resetting in ancient history and we're going to skip an awful lot of other stuff. I think ancient history really is important because it's foundational in developing the more complex spice, the more complex societies that we're going to see and study in history to the point where we are today. Ancient history set humanity on a very complex path for spice. It's brought us to where we are. And we saw a video the other day. Some would argue it's not a good path. We have competing states, nuclear weapons, plastic in the ocean. There's all kind of things that our Yanomamo ancestors or our Yanomamo living like ancestors would have not done. Ancient history set us on the path, good or bad. So, taking a look at the question here, number one is we looked at why is this idea of dismissing ancient history as irrelevant? What's my problem with that? Now, these are our goals. We're looking at the Neolithic Revolution. Remember, we are biologically Homo sapiens sapiens. The term we colloquially use are like man or humanity. How would the transition to farming create what we call civilized spice? The word civilized is kind of dicey sometimes. People kind of look at that as a value judgment about being civilized or uncivilized. Beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. But we'll try to at least come up with some tentative definition about civilized spice in this presentation. We're going to look at how these early civilizations we looked at how we could qualify them by spice. You looked at the city of and we're going to just step back, and that might help us a little bit as we move through this. And we're basically going to connect this starting point to the work you guys have been doing on China or the Indus Valley River, Mesopotamia, or in Egypt in terms of some of the places or the cradles of civilization where humanity took its first leap into civilization. Okay, there you have question two. If you could summarize that in one sentence. Stop if you feel like you need to catch up here. So, 10,000, 15,000 years ago, what was it like to be Homo sapiens sapien? Well, not much different than what we saw in the Yanomami, although they lived in a tropical rainforest. There were hunters and gatherers who lived in the steppes of northern Russia. There were hunters and gatherers who lived in the semi-desert regions of North Africa. It wasn't quite a desert yet. We know that one of the big issues at this time was moving out of Africa about 80,000 years ago. We call this the peopling of Earth, that human populations had arrived in Australia as early as 40,000 years ago, and we think around 10,000 years ago, humans were arriving in America. Some of the last places to be peopled would be the islands in the Pacific, like Hawaii, and that would be probably maybe a little more than just only 1,000 years ago. These people often lived like hunting and gatherers in bands of 20 to 50 people, where the relationships were all family based. And when a band got too large, they would split off and butt off and form another band. And as people drifted apart, forming their own small societies, we see cultural and biological drift. That's why, for example, American Indians have many of the features of East Asians because their drift was only about 10,000 years ago. The Aboriginals of Australia drifted and isolated themselves in that continent maybe about 40,000 years ago. And to a lesser degree, and more rapidly, we see a drift in culture. And that's what we see linguistic groups developing too, in the order of 5 to 15,000 years ago. These people had to adapt to different climates, different environments, but also things like the Ice Age are going to be very important. As the climate changed, people had to learn how to change their diet, change their living arrangements to survive it. Some humans began to innovate with food production rather than food gathering, probably as early as 12,000 years ago, during the time we call the Neolithic Revolution. Okay, so we're looking at question 4 for these next points. You take a look here on the map, and you'll see places where we see agriculture and the development of civilization. These areas are really small and relatively fragile. They're all based on agriculture, and agriculture forced a higher degree of interdependence, more organization. Their spice became or drifted toward the path we call civilization. But really, even as late as 1000 BC, they represented a very tiny percentage of all humanity and a very small part of the earth. Yet the patterns that developed in these centers would eventually kind of collide to form the global societies that we know today. I make that point here. Ancient societies, while being very small and really involving relatively small percentages of human populations, generated cultural patterns that would lead to our modern society. Humans followed the paths that we'll see in Egypt, in the Indus Valley, in China, and in Mesopotamia, among other places, as civilizations would eventually envelop the whole world. It's very few places on Earth today, like we saw the rainforest in the Amazon, where people have not been totally gripped by the vice of civilization. Okay, you want to stop for a moment, and we're looking at question 4. Now we're looking at going through spice and innovation. We're looking at I'm kind of using the spice acronym, but I'm not going in alphabetical or not in the order of the word. We're looking at it more in terms of starting with interaction, because interaction and farming draw right from the same place. We know that around 12,000 years ago, before the present, some societies began to adopt cereal agriculture and the domestication of animals. Interesting enough, you want to guess what the first domesticated animal was? Many people have hypothesized it's a cat, and not because they're cute, but because cats will chase mice. And of course, mice are very dangerous to grain supplies. And if the mice get into your grain supply, you starve to death. So having cats who could chase the mice would be a really important development. More dependable food supply than their neighbors, the agricultural societies had to work very hard, but they also had to settle in one place. They couldn't pick up and move when things got not going so well. Because they settled in one place, they changed the landscape. They would do irrigation and planting and terracing, and also putting together villages and eventually cities. We see the first farming patterns that we look at developed in the Neolithic age around 12,000 BC before the present in the Middle East. And we think that agriculture may have developed kind of independently, and it makes me believe that climate change, which was global, might have had an impact. There might have been some interaction between Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus, possibly, but China was so far away, and there's also New World farming civilizations that would develop a little bit later, which we're not going to discuss here at this point. So that was question number 5 on interaction. If you feel the need to pause, go ahead and do so. The video right here on the birth of farming, so I guess you'll need to pause this, and I want you to watch the 10-minute movie on the birth of farming. John Green is a novelist and a very quick thinker. He also has a series called Crash Course you may have watched before. And I think that some of his crash courses go kind of rapidly, but I believe that this one we could follow. And as you watch this, I want you to name 3 positive impacts of the Neolithic Revolution, 3 negative impacts of the Neolithic Revolution as you watch the video. Okay, you watched the video from John Green and looked at that. Now, I just have a couple of vignettes or pictures of farming. Here you have a drawing, an ink drawing. It appears from China, and it shows farming and how it might have looked like in China around 500 BC. Egypt is rich with art that depicts farming, and you see an Egyptian farmer there on the top right, and down below, the ubiquitous drones and GPS signals that guide modern day tractors and scientific agriculture. The population centers, the interaction that came from farming would lead to cities. You see New York City there at the bottom right, and above, I believe, is the city of the ziggurat or the prayer tower in the middle of the city. If you ever read the biblical story of the Tower of Babel, the Tower of Babel was one of these ziggurats or prayer temples. The next issue here is we're looking at agriculture creating interaction, more advanced political systems. People living together in river valleys required a greater degree of interdependence. And we've talked about what interdependence is and review some of the issues there. But we know that people in river valley civilizations had to be interdependent to wider networks than had the hunters and gatherers, or like our friends the Yanomamo. Governments were needed to organize to protect accumulated wealth and to protect hierarchies that came out of it, the rich and the poor. Cultural developments like writing would eventually help governments be able to govern more specifically and create first written law. Governments would control the accumulating surplus and would manage property rights between owners and also keep people as slaves. Governments were served by something called a bureaucracy, and a bureaucracy is an organization that carries out the role of government, like tax collectors and judges, etc. And governments would often use religion to justify and enforce authority. Think about that for a second. If your king was also a god, and when it rained or flooded your farm, because you could connect that easily to the disobedience you may have had, and of course, you don't want to suffer the anger of gods. You see that in the Old Testament in the story of Moses. Lawmakers are often claiming to receive their laws from God. Hammurabi's story, which predates Moses, is a good case in point. Here we have Hammurabi right up here receiving the laws from the god Shamash, who's sitting on the throne. This is a Harappan god king from the Indus Valley, and this is the United Nations, which represents modern governance on the international level. Social structures. Agriculture provided surpluses, and surpluses required more diverse occupations, and some occupations were more valuable and powerful than others. This creates something called stratification. So we're looking at social structures, and stratification puts people from the highest to the lowest castes or classes. Trade and specialization would draw people together, and institutions that would be needed to support them, like schools for teaching people how to read and write, the temples that would manage religious affairs, the army, all these things were institutions that, as societies became more complex, trained groups of people to assume the rules that more complex societies needed. Here's a picture of some social structures right here. You could see in ancient Egypt and modern day society, you could see education, according to this model, is a very important aspect of a person's social class, their power, prestige, and wealth. Okay, now you could start again. We're looking at the issue of cultural patterns, the C in spice. More complex societies and specialization made it possible for more advanced cultural practices. Better tools. A good example of this would be the potter's wheel, which would eventually morph into the wheel used for moving products. The Chinese developed a wheelbarrow, which of course helped the labor of Chinese, and that's a Chinese. So when you're working with a wheelbarrow, thank the Chinese. But one of the most important cultural patterns we're going to look at is writing. It was first used to manage surpluses and trade contracts. You'd simply draw a relationship of what you're trading, so if one person could not deliver on time, you had a record of what they were supposed to give you. But eventually, writing became more specialized, and only people who would learn how to write would know how to read. It was a specialty. It wasn't simply a picture of a grain or a cow. And scribes were the writing specialists, and they had a high status because they would have to train and get educated to be a scribe. As cultural patterns became more complex, writing became very important too. And I have some things I want you to ponder about writing. Let's take a look. There is some Egyptian writing, and you got your modern text message. Laugh out loud, LOL. There's some Sumerian cuneiform right there. Sumerian cuneiform has been basically translated today so that experts could read cuneiform. It's no longer a lost writing. Egyptian hieroglyphics, very beautiful, and one technology the Egyptians had was an early form of paper called papyrus, which was made out of reeds. It was a lost art, but by 1800 CE, archaeologists figured out how to read that. And there's Chinese calligraphy. That's the last piece here. Chinese still use the descendant of Chinese calligraphy. Now here's the mystery of mysteries. This is the script of the Harappan civilization. No one can read this today. Still a mystery as to what the Harappa were trying to say in their writing system. Well, this is going to be the end of the first part of the presentation. There'll be a short second part so we can finish this presentation.